The French Revolution is one of history's most celebrated uprisings. Liberty, equality, fraternity, the people rising against an unjust monarchy, the beginning of modern democracy. That is the version most people carry. Here's the version most people don't talk about. The revolution began as a demand for representation. It escalated into systematic mass execution. It produced a government that surveilled, controlled, and killed its own citizens at a scale the monarchy never had. And it ended with a military officer declaring himself Emperor of France. The people removed a king, then they got another one. So here's the question worth asking before any of the history. When a system is overthrown, how do you know the new one will actually be different? Here's what they didn't tell you about the French Revolution. By 1789, France was in crisis on multiple fronts simultaneously. The government was effectively bankrupt, having spent heavily on wars, including its support of the American Revolution. Harvests had failed across the country. Bread prices had risen to the point where ordinary people were spending the majority of their income on basic food, and the taxation system that was supposed to fund the state fell almost entirely on the Third Estate, the commoners, while the nobility and clergy were largely exempt. The inequality was not new. It had been embedded in French society for generations. What changed in 1789 was the convergence of economic desperation, Enlightenment ideas about natural rights and popular sovereignty, and a monarchy that had lost the political capacity to manage the crisis. When King Louis XVI convened the Estates General in May 1789 to address the financial situation, the Third Estate, representing approximately 97% of the French population, arrived with a century of grievances and a new vocabulary for expressing them. The demands that emerged were not initially revolutionary in the radical sense. Representation, limits on arbitrary royal power, a constitution, tax reform, these were the kinds of structural changes that reformers across Europe were arguing for. The ideas were circulating, the moment was charged, and the expectation among many of those involved was that France was about to become something more like England, with a constitutional monarchy and genuine parliamentary representation. Pause for a second. What actually happened next is where the story begins to diverge from the version most people learn. When a system is overthrown, how do you know the new one will be different? The short answer is that you do not. And the French Revolution is the most detailed case study in modern history for why that uncertainty matters. Within months of the initial political crisis, the situation in France had exceeded anything the reformers had planned for. The monarchy was not being constitutionally constrained, it was being abolished. The institutions that had structured French society, the church, the nobility, the legal system, were not being reformed. They were being dismantled. And the vacuum created by that dismantling was enormous, and this is where it changes. By 1792, France was at war with Austria and Prussia, whose monarchs feared that revolutionary ideas would spread to their own populations. The war created a new kind of pressure inside France. External threat combined with internal political instability produced conditions in which moderate leadership became very difficult to sustain. The more radical factions, those who believed the revolution was not going far enough, that enemies both inside and outside France needed to be defeated completely, gained power, and in 1793, those factions established what became known as the Committee of Public Safety. The Committee of Public Safety did not have the word safety in its name by accident. The argument for its authority was that the revolution was under existential threat from foreign armies and from domestic counter-revolutionaries, and that extraordinary measures were necessary to defend it. That argument was used to justify the period that followed, the period historians call the Reign of Terror. Now look at this. Between September 1793 and July 1794, approximately 17,000 people were officially executed by the revolutionary government in France. Estimates of those who died in prison or through extrajudicial violence run significantly higher, with some historians placing the total closer to 40,000. The targets included not only aristocrats and royalists, but also fellow revolutionaries who had advocated different political positions. The guillotine was used publicly. Denunciations by neighbors were encouraged and acted upon. Government created a surveillance infrastructure specifically designed to identify and eliminate enemies of the revolution. The movement that had begun with demands for liberty had produced a government that executed people for political dissent at a rate that exceeded anything the monarchy it replaced had done in its final years. If a movement for freedom creates fear and control, when does it stop being what it claimed to be? That question has no clean answer in the context of the Reign of Terror. The people who ran it believed, or at least argued, that the terror was necessary and temporary, that the revolution could not survive without eliminating the forces working against it, that the extraordinary measures were proportionate to the extraordinary threat. Maximilien Robespierre, the most prominent architect of the Terror, had spoken passionately about liberty and virtue before and during the period he helped create. He was not a cynic who had never believed the revolution's ideals. He was, in many accounts, someone who believed so completely that he was willing to kill anyone he believed was standing in their way. In July 1794, Robespierre was arrested by members of the National Convention who feared they were next. He was executed the following day. The period that followed, the Thermidorian reaction, represented a significant pullback from the radical policies of the Terror. But the political instability that had produced the Terror did not resolve itself. France cycled through multiple governmental forms over the following years, each attempting to stabilize a situation that kept generating new crises. And this is where the pattern completes itself. In November 1799, a general named Napoleon Bonaparte staged a coup. Through a combination of military prestige, political maneuvering, and the exhaustion of a population that had been living through a decade of revolution and instability, he established himself as first consul, effectively the head of government. In 1804, he declared himself Emperor of France. A crowd gathered to watch him crowned. It was not so different from the crowds that had watched Louis XVI rule, except that this ruler had risen from the lower nobility through military achievement rather than through royal birth. The revolution had removed a king. It had produced a republic that executed tens of thousands. It had cycled through multiple unstable governments. And it had ended with a man who held more concentrated personal power than Louis XVI had exercised in his final years. If a revolution ends with another strong leader in control, what actually changed? The careful answer is more than it might seem, but less than the revolution's ideals promised. The legal and social structures of the old regime were genuinely dismantled. The principle of feudal nobility, with its tax exemptions and hereditary privileges, did not return in its old form. The revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty became permanent features of French political language, and eventually of European political thought more broadly. The Napoleonic Code, the legal system Napoleon implemented, was itself a product of revolutionary thinking about individual rights, and became one of the most influential legal documents in modern history. But the specific promise of the revolution, that the people would govern themselves through representative institutions, free from arbitrary executive power, was not what France got. It got Napoleon. And Napoleon got an empire that extended across most of continental Europe before it collapsed. This is where people start to disagree, because the assessment of what the French Revolution actually achieved depends almost entirely on your time horizon and your framework for evaluation. From the perspective of 1800, the revolution produced 12 years of upheaval, a civil war in some regions, tens of thousands of executions, and a military dictatorship. From the perspective of the 19th century, the ideas the revolution had introduced into political discourse had irreversibly altered the terrain of European politics. From the perspective of the long arc, the revolution contributed to the eventual establishment of democratic governance in France and shaped the political development of Europe in ways that persisted for 2 centuries. The reframe is not that the revolution was a failure or a success. The reframe is that it was a demonstration of something more fundamental, that the most dangerous moment in any revolutionary process is not the overthrow of the old system. It is the period immediately after, when the old system is gone and the new one has not yet consolidated. The vacuum that exists in that space is not neutral, it is contested, and the thing that fills it is determined not by the ideals of the people who created the vacuum, but by the specific balance of forces, personalities, and circumstances that exist when the dust begins to settle. The revolution wanted liberty, it got the Terror, then it got Napoleon, not because the people who started it were naive or dishonest, because the space that opens when a system collapses does not belong to anyone until someone fills it. So here's the question worth sitting with. If removing power creates a vacuum, who really decides what fills it? And how often does what fills it end up looking different from what people actually fought for? Tell me in the comments what you think, because that question is not just about France in 1789, it is about every moment in history when a system falls and something has to take its place.